I just want to say that if it was up to me, we'd have a break, we'd have a little bit of, but Marianne and her team are very hard taskmasters, so we're going to just keep going, and we do want to try and stay on schedule. So I just want to say a few things and then set up the context for our next 4 speakers. I want to say with sadness that, of course, this conference is taking place without Martin Roth, one of our great colleagues, who passed away a few weeks ago. And I was reminded, as I was reading about him, what he said when he left the Victoria and Albert Museum, which was that museums are not just repositories of objects, they're also repositories of values. And I think it's important to think of that, because we have to think how to bring those values alive, make us relevant in the present. And in many ways, for me, this frames the discussions that we're going to have over the next few days. Whose values, what values? As Neil said, who gets to describe those values and speak those values? I want to say that my role as moderator is to move things along. My role as moderator is not to be a presenter, but sort of like the guy in a circus. Well, I guess sometimes it was a woman, but there's the stick, and then there's the plate. And the plate starts to get a bit wobbly, and the role of that person was to go around and just make it not wobble so much. And I think that's sort of my role as a moderator, to make sure that the spinning plates keep spinning. So let me say 2 things about protocol. I'm going to try and keep us going according to schedule. It's going to be tough because I'm already 7 minutes over. So I'm setting a poor example, but it is important that we stay on schedule. And I'm not sure about cultural difference. I can tell you in Canada or the United States, I'd just get up on the stage, tap them on the shoulder and say, sit down. I don't know that if I can do that here, but I do want to say that I'm hoping that all speakers will keep to their allotted time, because it will show respect for other speakers. And the way you do it is you look down here and you see a screen, and as long as it says green, you can keep going, and as soon as it turns red, you're meant to stop. So everybody knows, they've been informed of the time period of their remarks. I hope we can stick to it as best we can. I also want to say that I will introduce all of the speakers, and I know relatively few of them personally. So I'm just going to read what's in the brochure. Let me tell you that in Boston, what I often do in a staff meeting, and I just want to say, Marianne, it's very interesting, is you get the person to introduce the person next to them. And you find out a lot about your institution when somebody has to introduce one of their colleagues. But none of the speakers are sitting, well, some of the speakers are sitting next to each other and some aren't, so I can't do that. So I'm just simply going to read from the text, and then I hope in the context of questions that we'll pose afterwards, we might be a little bit more personal. So I want to say again that our conference takes place in a time of great shift. One question for me is that shift new, or is the public expression of that shift new? Is it something that's been there and we hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it, or is it something that is truly new in terms of a phenomena? Some of the shifts are irreversible, and that's what I meant earlier when I said we must assume that we are in a moment of crisis in museums. There's a new economy allowed by technology. There's mobility of ideas through many kinds of travel and exchange. And there's something which I believe museum folks have to think about quite a bit, 3D printing, which I think is going to actually challenge our notion of what constitutes the objects in our care. All of these erase distinctions between the real and the imagined, between the real and the artificial, and dare I say it, real news and fake news. So our conversations today, I think, take place with this overriding questions: what can we do to change this trajectory? And I think as we reflect, as we will, on what Neil shared with us, this was the question he was asking and challenging us to think about. What are our obligations? So definitions of museums is a good place to start. And one thing really interesting for us to track is, can we actually define a common language? Likely not. But keeping that question alive, I think, is very important for us. What is a common language as we describe museums? Just want to say that I think about words like narrative, witness, voice, chronology, utility, ownership, conflict, audience. As a museum director, I think about those things, and I think in some way those words thread their way through all of today's discussions. So 4 speakers, each are going to share their thoughts in defining the museum. Then we're all going to come up, the 4 speakers and myself, sit here, and we'll do the same thing, and then I'll try and keep us on schedule. So for the 4 speakers, I'm going to follow the order in the book. So the first speaker is ANNETTE BHAGWATI, who is a project manager at the Haus der Kunst, Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. Her projects include the New Alphabet, 100 Years of Now, the Anthropocene Project, and Former West. She studied ethnology, geography, and African art at Freiburg, Berlin, and London. Following her PhD at the University of London, SOAS, she worked as program coordinator and deputy manager of the HKVW's Visual Arts Department. She taught between 2009 and 2012 in the Department of Art History at Concordia University in Montreal. Her primary research focuses include issues relating to transcultural curating, museum and exhibition history, global art, and African art.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. I have to keep to time, so I will be brief with my first remarks. You listed a whole range of terms that usefully could be examined in greater depth in order to tackle this very complex question, as Neil McGregor has rightly pointed out, the role of encyclopedic museums in complex political times. So one of the terms that actually, I think, if I'm not mistaken, didn't figure in your list, so I would like to add it, is the notion of the term of the encyclopedic itself, at least in the sense in which it is used by many of its institutional proponents. So I'm very grateful for the organizers having invited me here to share some thoughts on the notion of encyclopedic in this context. Now, in his much-cited book, Museums Matter, James Kuno, the CEO of the Getty Trust, describes encyclopedic museums as, I quote, cosmopolitan institutions which gather and present representative examples of the world's artistic cultures under one roof. By doing so, he continues, they, and I quote, work to dissipate ignorance and superstition about the world and promote tolerance of difference itself. An encyclopedic museum's promise, according to Kuno, is to create a space in which all artistic cultures of the world are present. Like in a microcosm, these cultures become tangible through compelling objects that exemplify the character and specifics of each culture. This space is therefore comprehensive. Its ambition nothing less than the world. Accordingly, most encyclopedic museums order their exhibition spaces by geographical or cultural regions, so that each visitor may have the opportunity to travel the world within the confines of a limited space, to be enthralled by its diversity, actually by diversity itself, and in the process gain insight into the rich variety of worldwide cultural expression through a survey of the selected objects. Hence another widely used term for this type of museum, the Universal Survey Museum. The reference frameworks of encyclopedic museums thus are nothing less than world and time. And yet, are they therefore automatically encyclopedic in the sense of, as the dictionary has it, and of the sense in which it's often perceived, all and everything comprehensive coverage, the universal? Kuno's definitions already points to an inner contradiction between the encyclopedic museum's aspirations and its methods. The aspiration obviously is to show everything there's to show in representative fashion. But already Kuhn's term, the representative examples, clarifies that that which is shown, that which the visitor can see, always is the result of selection, of choice. A selection that must be, by necessity, be based on a specific perspective, a specific narrative, the foundation idea of a museum, the mandates shaping its collection, a pedagogical vision. With this narrative in mind, the curators sift through the depots of objects and materials and select those that appear to be the best fit to the narrative. Thus, the world that is shown in an encyclopedic museum is not representative in any objective or disinterested sense. It is always curated, and that's not, A random, non-informed visitor will always encounter a very specific image of the world, despite its richness and diversity. One that not so much represents the world as it represents a narrative adopted by an institution based on a collection that must be by necessity historically contingent. This discrepancy can lead to curious, perhaps distortion might say, or certain distortions in the visitor's perception of the world, especially in transcultural exhibition contexts. For example, the focus on material cultures in most encyclopedic museums can lead to a kind of underrepresentation or of aesthetic tradition, or that are not become that prominently presented, that are based on perishable or non-tangible materials. Oh, sorry, that's the sorry. Can I get the next one? Yeah. In many museums, this focus on object culture leads to the fact that other aesthetic traditions, such as amongst the Dinka, who have a very elaborate aesthetic of surrounding as herdsmen around the cow and the beauty of the horns, and it includes other non-tangible, sort of immaterial aesthetic practices and aesthetic discourse, is underrepresented, whilst they're presented with their objects. In this case, that's the only object in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the beaded bodies. Another, equally, a narrative interested in artistic achievements may lead curators to privilege that those objects that meet standards of the masterpieces, the Western masterpieces, whilst other objects from that same culture that, in their culture of origin, might be more important, are moved to the depot or shown in other institutional contexts. And there's an example where it's quite interesting to see they're both connected. This is the Louvre Pavillon de Session and Musée Quai Branly, and this very dramatic masterpiece display of this head, and a very different, sort of more in an ensemble, in the Quai Branly works from Oceania, they're displayed very differently. And this display emphasizing the masterpiece is not predominant here. The fact that the collections of most encyclopedic museums were accumulated through a specific historically contingent process also leads to other kinds of prioritization. For example, the fact that ancient Greece and Rome and the Middle East are reference cultures for European civilization, plus I think a very specific collection history, might explain why exhibits from these regions are spread out over 17 galleries in the British Museum, whilst others, such as Africa or Mexico, fill one room here in the British Museum. It might also have other other reasons, but this is sort of how it's represented here. And this ratio is not necessarily related to the total amount of exhibits from these different cultures in the museum depots. So the Africa collection, if I'm not mistaken, comprises more than 200,000 objects in the museum. Thus, it seems clear that such museums do not show or represent everything there's to show. They are not, I would argue, not encyclopedic in the sense of all there is to see or all there is, but rather selective and representative. They order the world according to a specific perspective that determines which objects should be quiet, which should be hidden away, and which go on public display. But do we therefore need to abandon the term encyclopedic? Or could we imagine an institution that rightfully could call itself so? If yes, what could it look like? Taking literally any encyclopedia by its very nature is always a utopian project. Human knowledge grows exponentially. What we know is determined by our perspective. An encyclopedic museum can thus obviously neither be objective nor all-encompassing. Having said this, I think the idea of the encyclopedic, I would argue, is still relevant, particularly today. Yet it has nothing to do with the desire of another universal survey. What needs to be encyclopedic, I think, is not the museum as an institution, but rather its very method. The encyclopedic method of approaching and understanding the world. This method, and I would like to go back to the encyclopedic spirit of Diderot and D'Alembert, is laid out in their famous Encyclopédie Dictionnaire Raisonné. They did not only aim to make the knowledge of their time accessible to all, but even more accessible to reason and discourse. To this end, they did not present knowledge as a unified argument from a learned authority, but rather allowed different ways of knowing. And Marianne has pointed out, I think, 140 contributors. And more importantly, not only contributors, but also contributors from very different backgrounds. So craftsmen were also, as of on an equal level, invited to contribute, as were scientists or historians of the time. So they were not only interested in merely collecting knowledge as a collection of facts, they were much more deeply interested also in that, I think this is the most important point, deeply interested in connecting and cross-referencing different knowledges. As Diderot writes, in collecting our dictionnaire of all the things known to the realms of the sciences, the arts and the crafts, it is imperative that we bring their mutual interconnections to light and through the links grasp the principle that underlie them. The Encyclopédie, therefore, encouraged the active relational engagement of knowledges in non-hierarchical and transdisciplinary order, highlighting confluences and nodes of different ways of knowing, to use a term by Tim Ingold. In a time like ours, and that's my point I would like to make, that is marked by unprecedented global interconnectedness and changing knowledge constellations, by epistemological fault lines, and a continual need to adopt new perspectives, and on the political side also, which is also marked by an increasing xenophobia and nationalism, Diderot and D'Alembert's approach seems to be more salient than ever. In today's more complex world, however, we must take this approach to the next level. We need not only consider, understand and collect different bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing. We also need to bring them together in changing constellations, intertwine them and activate their possible synergies. The new perspectives arising from this mesh of knowledge trajectories will not only afford us an inexhaustible resource that will allow us to deal with the changing world in flexible, context-sensitive ways. They also urge us to consider the existence of parallel, co-equal narratives and offer reference points that can help us triangulate our own position in this relational network. And I think this goes really beyond just but tolerating difference. We really have to see ourselves, situate ourselves in an entangled world. Here, the grand museums with their abundant collections represent significant potential, I would think. Over centuries, they have assembled objects from a large variety of historical, cultural contexts under one roof. But instead of clinging to the idea of a universal survey, as many museums still do, they need to develop and ceaselessly activate the immense knowledge potential that is latent both in the objects and the institution itself. Instead of embedding their objects in a single narrative framework, for example, they need to offer a maximum of paths that will permit each visitor to encounter their collection through a multiplicity of perspectives. This means, above all, a transparent and proactive engagement with the museum's own institutional and collection history. A first step could be the activation of objects in the depot, in a way that is similar to the objects in the exhibition hall, a depot raisonné, if you will. Instead of focusing on the acquisition or display of even better or more representative examples, funds might be used to research and display the different frames of references, way of knowing, the inter-object links that make entanglements and conflicting viewpoints visible and tangible. This could be achieved, for example, by greatly increasing the frequency and diversity of special exhibitions. Expanded labels could be regularly updated and remain responsive to contemporary reactions and new knowledge, the Bremen example. These last not least, and this is my last point, because I see the time is up, last not least, I would argue that objects and knowledge should not only be mobilized within the institution, but really beyond, through collaborations worldwide, and not, as you rightly said, not as an export, but really enter into reconfigurations of new knowledges and perhaps come back changed and be expanded and looked upon in this new new meaning. These and other similar methods to me would constitute a truly contemporary encyclopedic approach, and thus perhaps one answer to the question of how an institution like the museum could evolve to stay relevant in today's politically complex societies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Beatrice von Bismarck is Professor for Art, History, and Visual Culture. You're next. At the Academy of Fine Arts in Leipzig. From 1989 to 1993, she worked at the Städel Museum in Frankfurt for 20th century art, and from 1993 to 1999 at the Lüneburg University. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Kunstraum der Universität Lüneburg, a project space. From 2000 to 2012, she was the program director of the Leipzig Academy's Gallery and the co-founder of the /D/O/C/K Project Bereich project space. 2009, initiator of the Cultures of the Curatorial MA program, and her current research areas are the curatorial, the effects of neoliberalism and globalization on the cultural field, and postmodern concepts of the artist. I might say that I've known Beatrice for a while as a friend, and it's wonderful to welcome you to the podium as a colleague. It's a long way from tea in the basement of the Courtauld at 4 p.m.
Thank you, Matthew, for the personal introduction. And thank you, Marion, very much for the invitation. I try to speak as fast as I can to go through the allotted minutes by talking about, we were asked to do some statements. So this is hopefully a very brief statement, very specific one in its approach. We have already heard quite a bit about the current museological and curatorial discourse, and in it, the Encyclopedic Museum is addressed under the label of, or the public access is one of the key requirements we have already heard mentioning quite a few times. To offer a collection as comprehensive and diversified as possible, to audiences as wide and themselves diversified as possible in number and spectrum, appears as the paramount demand. This aim is described in terms of welcoming, of giving and offering, of generosity, of generating a public space, and of allowing for a learning situation. As much as generally speaking, these qualities are doubtlessly most desirable for the Encyclopedic Museum, they tend to focus more on the collection's coverage than, and we have heard that with Annette's contribution just now, than on the historical, but also on the current practices that brought them about and still shape them today. The ambivalence arising from this perspectival bias I would like to follow for the next 10 minutes along the lines of the condition of hospitality, and hospitality as the condition, I think, which precisely encompasses the above-mentioned aims of welcoming, giving, offering, of being generous, of opening a public space, and of generating a learning situation. The concept, the condition of hospitality does so, however, by playing out the conflicting preconditions interests, and effects that have been the ground for much of the critique raised against an affirmative embrace of the Encyclopedic Museum. To begin with, the hospitable situation of the museum implies invitations, and not only to artists and not only to visitors, but of course also invitations to artworks or to audiences or to other institutions and other communities. It receives, it welcomes, and temporarily, for a longer, shorter term, brings people and objects together, most of which have left their habitual surroundings and find themselves in the process of relocation in the sense of being a guest. Thus, unfamiliar with one another, the hospitable situation in the museum provides both the time and the space for encounter. It offers resources to satisfy very different kinds of needs, gives materials and physical support, but also responds to a need for recognition, respect, or attention. Finally, and very importantly, it operates with the aporia between unconditionality and regulated conditionality that is inherent to all thinking around hospitality. Between an unconditional welcoming, that is, and acceptance of the other, that is, on the one hand, which means accommodating anything and everything that is on the move and interested in accepting that hospitality, and the marginalization and exclusions legitimized through various rules and regulations in the field, on the other hand. Viewed from this perspective, the hospitable conditions of the museum resonate with the current socio-political situation. It reflects key topics evoked in discussions concerning the current migrant situation, the conditions along the borders and accommodations for refugees. I'm not making a bracket around Europe here, but I might well do that. Including issues of the decontextualization, displacement, and rootlessness, encounters with the foreign and with foreign people, the satisfaction of basic human needs, and processes of access, restriction, inclusion, and exclusion. Within this socio-political context, the fundamentally positive connotations of hospitality conjures up also in the museum field, where it appears to stand mostly for positions of generosity that takes the interest of the guest, i.e. the audiences, the artists, and the works into consideration. These positive connotations stem from an idea of unconditional hospitality of the kind that Jacques Derrida has defined in his Of Hospitality text. Here, we find an update of the open concept of accommodating all those who travel. Understood as an anthropological, fundamental right, this concept persisted into the Middle Ages, although laws redefining hospitality in the sense of aliens or foreigners' law emerged as early as antiquity. This increasingly restrictive nation-regulated hospitality right led to the birth of the foreigner and at the same time to the dismissal of the guest. The negatively connoted understanding of a legally mandated hospitality in terms of exclusion draws its legitimacy mostly from the guest's intangibility. It touches on the temporary circumstances of the guest who, in order to be a guest, is only present and allowed to be present for a limited period of time. And this temporariness, this transcends the fleetingness that characterize hospitality, designate the guest as something or somebody unfixable in time and space. It is in this moment of the ungraspable that makes the encounter with the guest occasionally uncanny and triggers the impulse for regulation and control. Consequently, powers power effects have pervaded hospitality since no later than the dawn of the modern age. They're largely aimed at the allocation of resources to those, or defining the identity and status of those considered guests. In the museum field, intangibility and control efforts, it triggers from restrictions to assimilations. It applies not only to people, but also to objects, understood as a situation that brings people, things, spaces, and discourses together and into the public. The museum accommodates and hosts not only humans, but also artworks, artifacts, and display objects. In the expanded environment, these guests might also include objects that are only temporarily incorporated into the museum, having been introduced by other participants, such as the visitors, for example, umbrellas, iPhones, base caps, stools, or entering the situation through another kind of interim use setup, such as meals or an accompanying program. The means and processes of allocation and defining, which are employed to counter the intangibility of the mobile and transitory, cast activities traditionally associated with the museum in a different light. Viewed in the context of hospitality, the acts of selecting, collecting, organizing, preserving, and mediating more manifestly reveal the ambivalence between care and custody on the one hand, and classification into existing value systems and thus alienation on the other. Analogous to the socio-political context, acts of naming and identifying, categorizing and ordering, and assessment exemplify forms of, if you want, subjugation to existing criteria and standards, thus forming the basis both for hierarchization and exclusion. Accordingly, these acts also form the basis for allocating space, the key resource of hospitality. Having space, or the opportunity to take up space, refers in the first instance to a physical space, that is, in the context of the museum, in fact, rooms or institutional space. But beyond that, and far more comprehensively, space in the context of hospitality refers to an openness towards the guest that includes the social, physical, and political areas of action, and quite fundamentally the realm of thinking. Giving the guest space is determinant for the qualitative and quantitative allocation of those resources, namely time, finances, or materials that are required for temporary stay and allow the guest to appear with the resultant form of encounter, communication, exchange, and mediation of all participants within the museum situation. The specific modes of making these allocations, who they accept and how they reject, who they benefit and which benefits are at stake for each participant involved in this situation, these modes of making allocations are best understood in terms of the paradoxical logic of giving. To the extent that the thinking around giving is tied to reciprocity, in the anthropological and sociological tradition, hospitality and hospitable openness towards the guest also sees itself in the compensatory relationship. In this sense, the giving of space creates a social obligation or commitment, which is manifested in a mutual exchange defined by rules. For the museum situation, this functionalization of giving or as part of an exchange economy points to the fact that hospitality also entails opportunities for the hosts, and that is individuals as much as institutions. Opportunities not only in terms of guaranteeing the existence and survival, the respect and appreciation of the guests, but also of stabilizing the own status. Both curators and art institutions find that extending invitations and making one's own house available for the encounter is a means of enhancing also the institutional survival in the first place. Vice versa, the acceptance or rejection of an invitation in the specific articulation and definition of one's own guest status can also mean that artists, freelance curators, representatives of other institutions, cultural communities, but also various parts of the audiences acquire themselves social, economic, cultural, and quite significantly symbolic capital and experience their mutual revaluation. The effects of evaluating and codifying powers become visible in the relationship the hospitable museum condition enables. The gift can be reduced to an economized reciprocity, tailored to usability and calculated purpose, and, analogous to the various resource allocations, it can be subjected to criteria brought into force by naming, ordering, and evaluation. This process establishes the prerequisites and conditions of the museum situation, but also the hierarchies and dependencies between those involved, the limits of the guest space, and the roles as curator or host, as artist or curator, as subject or object, as local or foreign. Attributions and acceptance of responsibility are key to museum hospitality in these processes. Taking curatorial responsibility for exhibits and collection objects invokes the Latin word curare, to take care of, where the profession has its historical genesis or base. Responsibility grounds, if you will, the curatorial profession's traditional service orientation. It does so first and foremost in the interest of the art objects and artifacts, then in the expanded sense for the artists, institutions, and the public. In recourse to the term curare, the connection to responsibility establishes and defines the very powers that offer protection, respect, and recognition on the one hand, but also at the same time what determine the status and for the say, or for that matter lack of say, given to those taken responsibility for. And I come to the end. Just as, to follow Pierre Bourdieu's argument, an invitation can never be turned down completely, because even rejection is still an answer within the logic of giving. Attempts to ignore, blank out, or neutralize the paradoxes and aporias moored in hospitality also fall short. More promising in terms of critical analysis in the context of the Encyclopedic Museum appears to be taking its specific possibilities seriously and to map and carry out the contradictory nature of the hospitality relations on a, if you will, meta level. What comes into focus then are less identities, but more practices, the way in which someone or something becomes a host or a guest, operates as a host or a guest, the acts by which and within which the hospitable relationships are taking shape as becoming or continuously re-performed. With this praxeological perspective, the museum space of hospitality constitutes itself through active references and temporary relationships of participating actors and actants among themselves, and can be understood in terms of a continuation of the post-colonial concept of contact zone of people and things. Roles and positions, those of host and guest, and the relations to curators, artists, visitors, communities, institutions, appear explicit as the result of power and conflict-determined attributions that are mutually interchangeable, especially against prevailing traditions or rules. This consequently releases tasks from a fixed connection to a specific role or to a specific position, so that acts of inviting and hosting, resource allocation and designation, of learning and caring can be repeated and assumed in many ways and from various sides. With this understanding, hospitality appears temporalized and in the sense of hosting. Processed, complexified, and multiplied, it is, in the words of Mireille Rosello, I quote, played and replayed at many different levels among a multitude of actors whose position of power and powerlessness is not only relative, but also disconnected from their identity, unquote. The relations which form the hospitable constellation are accordingly dynamic and remain dynamic. With this understanding, the Encyclopedic Museum can both make operative and portray these relations in all their historical and current conflicts, ambivalences and paradoxes, and in their potential to develop and change. The socio-political relevance of an encyclopedic museum thus depends on its ability as an institution to allow for the continuous change between the roles of guest and host, which means to format itself as an arena for these processes amongst all participants, but also to understand itself as much as a host, as a guest, as a guest within its local or wider international contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatrice. Dorothea van HANTELMANN is an art historian, writer, and curator. After working as a curatorial assistant at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and a research fellow at the Freie Universität Berlin, she held a position as Documenta visiting professor at the Universität Kassel. She is currently professor of art and society at Bard College, Berlin. Her research and writing is mainly centered on theoretical considerations of art and exhibition culture in the present. She is the author of How to Do Things with Art, on the meaning of art's performativity, and is currently working on a publication about the socio-cultural function of exhibitions from the early modern period to the present day. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also I would like to thank Marion Ackermann and Florence Thomas and Ute Thomas for inviting and bringing me here. So, I'm the third in this kind of speed dating series here, and I'll really try to stick with the 10 minutes. We'll see if I manage. Generally speaking, we can look at museums from two perspectives. The first one, which is the perspective of art history, understands museums as places, as repositories for objects which are conceived as important treasures of cultural heritage. In that perspective, museums are places that collect and classify these objects before they put them on display for a public. That's the common and dominant view of how museums are understood. The other perspective, and we actually also, this also has been mentioned today, which is a more anthropological and sociological one, sees museums as civilizing rituals for citizens in democracies. In that view, this hasn't been mentioned, but it has been mentioned that museums are not just repositories for objects, but also production sites or cultivation sites for specific values, and this is what I mean by this other perspective. In that view, museums are seen as places that have an impact on the conduct and the behavior of people, shaping it according to core concepts and values of modern societies. People like Carol Duncan or Tony Bennett, who speaks of museums as, I quote, instruments of social governance, as civic laboratories, have articulated this perspective. Among these core concepts is, for instance, that of the individual. The museum historically arises as the first public ritual that explicitly addresses the individual, both by displaying works by individuals, such as artists, but also by offering individualized and individualizing forms of perception. You can go alone or in pairs, decide yourself where to go. There is no collective direction of attention, no collective course of action, and so on. So one might call it, in the history of, let's say, ritualistic forms of gathering, one could call the museum a particularly liberal kind of ritual. Along that line of thinking, the National Gallery, for instance, is not only a place where the cultural wealth of a nation is presented, it is also a place where the modern nation gathers in its specifically modern structure, that is, not as a collective, not as a mass, but as a gathering of individuals, thereby embodying and ritualizing the idea of the individual. An individual, however, that is connected to material objects, thereby establishing and cultivating the core nexus not only of modern Western culture, but also of modern productivist worldview in general, in which the produced material object becomes the source of economic wealth and the source of cultural refinement. I could go on with naming other kind of pillars of a modern socioeconomic order and how it is cultivated and ritualized and embodied by visitors and objects alike in museums, but I won't. My main point is that there are these two perspectives, the kind of art historical common one and the more sociological, anthropological one, how museums are understood, and they are not always compatible with each other, because for the first one, the museum is basically a container for artworks, for objects and artifacts that mark its actual center. While for the second, these artifacts are props, as Bennett calls them, for carrying certain fundamental values and concepts into society, which happens not only and maybe not even primarily through the objects that are on display, but through the format as such. So where does this distinction take us in relation to the Encyclopedic Museum? I'll say a few words about where it takes me. First of all, to the embeddedness of the Encyclopedic Museum in a colonialist and imperialist mindset of the 19th century. While, of course, the idea of the encyclopedic, and I'm very grateful for Annette that she mentioned Diderot, because, of course, the idea of the encyclopedic is, I mean, first of all, goes back to antiquity and is also not a European idea. There are Chinese encyclopedias and Arabic encyclopedias, but the specific connection of the encyclopedic to the museum is a concept that, with prefigurations in the early modern period, comes to its full unfolding as a constitutive part of a 19th century possessive and appropriating idea of culture. According to that mindset, one walks through the museum, through the world history that is represented in material artifacts in order to become an owner, one could say, in a double sense, in relation to the world and to oneself. This togetherness of, excuse me for saying this in German, Weltanschauung, Selbstaneignung und Weltaneignung. So it's like a worldview appropriation of oneself and the world in kind of one format. Has been criticized many times, especially in relation to encyclopedic museums. Precisely because of that, there is a lot of critical research and reflection currently being done with regard to this concept and to these collections. I'm referring to projects such as Museum Global, initiated by the German Federal Cultural Foundation, and to exhibitions such as the post-war exhibition at the Haus der Kunst in Munich. So collections are reordered and expanded, repositionings are taking place that accommodate and depict transcultural interrelations, exchange processes, and mutual dependencies that had so far remained invisible in the traditional modernist narratives of display. My question now is how far this project, this reinvention of the encyclopedic, let's say in the 21st century, can go as long as it operates only, or at least primarily, on this level of this first paradigm that I mentioned, on the level of the museum as a container that produces value and meaning by the objects and artifacts and artworks that it presents, by what these objects represent. This is not, by no means I would want to discredit these projects that of course are extremely important today. Boris Greuß once described the museum collection as an expanded version of a parliament. And in that sense, the question of who belongs to this parliament, and I'm referring to what Marion Ackermann said at the beginning about the collection of MoMA and how they took the Gauguin out and substituted it by who was it, Sarah Diet, I think. Of course, this kind of recompositions of this parliament, one could say, are extremely important, especially in a time where politics openly operate with questions of who is part and who is not part, and it's important to use this representational power of the collection to represent the opposite, inclusion, openness, and pluralism. My concern, or maybe question, is that while these old Western, partly colonialist and universalist narratives are worked against on this level of representation, what happens to them on the level of what provides the ground of this representation, on the level of the entire format into which they also are inscribed, in the regime of the census that is operating in the museum, in certain notions of the subject, of the object, and so on, which connects a little bit to what Olafur Eliasson, I think who's not joining us anymore, but earlier said about how important it is to work with these regimes in the museum. It is necessary to analyze and critique how so many of these objects have been ripped of their respective cultural context and in order to become part of the encyclopedic museums of European museums. But don't we equally have to question the assumption that underlies these practices? Namely, the idea that you can extract objects from their original context in order to gather them somewhere else. The assumption that a culture, a society, can be represented by means of objects that are extracted from somewhere else. This assumption, this movement in itself is not cosmopolitan, as CUNY describes the Encyclopedic Museum. It is not natural. It is deeply embedded in a Western productivist, materialized, and imperialist mindset. What triggers these thoughts here are conversations that I've had with, in the past years, with art, I have to say, art museum directors, people whose work I respect immensely, by the way, that told me about how they had managed to expand their art collections beyond the Western horizon, reaching out to incorporate artworks from Africa, Southeast Asia, India, etc., in order to come to a point where they today can proudly say that their collection represents pluralism, diversity, and cosmopolitanism. So that would be my question. What constitutes the ground on which these, in a kind of encyclopedic manner, expanded collections today stand? This ground is still the modality to gather a plethora of objects that represent the world and to situate oneself in the midst of them. Which seems to be very, very basic and fundamental and almost too fundamental to mention maybe, but of course it's a modality that is deeply Western. And the fact that these objects are now not stolen but happily given along a sort of expanded exhibitionary, or globally expanded exhibitionary complex and art market doesn't change the fact that it's, to me, is still kind of universalist worldview or mindset that is operating here. The belief that there can be such thing as a common ground on which all these objects and artworks can coexist, and that this common ground is the museum. This belief seems to still be perpetuated here. And in all kind of modesty, I would ask, is it still valid to hold up this belief? And what nurtures it, if not ultimately a universalist and colonizing thought style? To present a culture in objects and artifacts in a kind of liberal ritual, this is a Western game, we could say, tied to the history of Western materialist, object-oriented and productivist societies. As such, it is neither neutral nor necessarily universally relevant in the 21st century, maybe. So my question or plea to end would be to, in all modesty, critically question even that foundations, these foundations, instead of just expanding them or complexifying them on the level of the narratives and composition of the collection. And maybe end with something that also Olafur Eliasson mentioned when he spoke of a festival. Festivals, which is also something that I, in working on a lot on Documenta in the past, which has become much more and more like a festival, have been quite interested in, because one could, for instance, ask, and excuse me if this is kind of going too far, but maybe the idea of the universal in today's time would much rather be represented in a hip-hop festival that would rather provide something like a common ground or a common language or all these things that we are talking here about, than in this collection, in these existing collections of objects. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure now to introduce James SNYDER, who became the International President and Director Emeritus of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem in January of 2007. You know, in my job, I get to introduce presidents all the time. It makes me feel good to call you president. In this newly created role, SNYDER works on behalf of the network of international friends of the museum and focuses on relationships with sister institutions and collectors worldwide. By the way, that gender-loaded term was written here. I didn't make it up. SNYDER joined the museum as the Anne and Jerome Fisher Director in 1997. During his tenure, he raised the museum's international profile by securing major loans and organizing traveling exhibitions, expanded its encyclopedic holdings, and established the International Friends in 16 countries. Under his leadership, museum attendance more than doubled to nearly 1 million visitors, and the museum's endowment grew to $200 million American. He also spearheaded a series of architectural enhancements, culminating with an expansion and renewal by James Carpenter Design Associates and Efrat Kowalski Architects. SNYDER was Deputy Director of the Museum of Modern Art in New York from 1986 to 1996. He is a graduate of Harvard University and a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. James SNYDER.
Matthew, I'm quite sure we wrote sibling institutions. It must have been mistranslated. In any case, I think I'm the last speaker of the day, and I see in your eyes that you would like speaking perhaps to stop. So I'm going to keep my comments focused in order to open our thinking, perhaps, for the continuation tomorrow about notions of encyclopedic museums. And actually, I want to introduce this other term. Everyone keeps using interchangeably the notion of universal museums. And I don't want us to discuss what the distinction is, but in fact, I think part of what we are about in these conversations is thinking about how encyclopedic museums need to stretch themselves because of the times in which we are living. So that's the first point. The second, and I was very touched by it separately, both Olafur and Marian referred to themselves as naive and idealistic. And I hope that those attributes apply to me as well, and I hope they apply to all of us here, because for what we do in the museum field and for the state of the world today, I think it's critically important that we all remain both naive and idealistic at all times. Finally, before I begin, Neil spoke. There was so much resonance between what Neil said about encyclopedic becoming universal as it relates to the history of the British Museum. Curiously enough, it relates so much to my experience in the Israel Museum. I'm going to save that for tomorrow. Kindly, I've been asked to speak in the afternoon, and that's where you'll hear more about this. But for the moment, I really want to speak about stretching to universalism and perhaps open our thinking a bit. Having said that, I myself was trained as a modernist art historian. I did go to a pretty fine school, and at the same time, my entire thinking began in 1850. I only thought about 1850 as the platform for the revolution that would enable the creation, the invention of modernism. In 1996, I went for the first time to Israel, to Jerusalem, to see the Israel Museum, and I was stunned to discover 1.5 million years of material culture gathered together there, which actually formed the platform of 1850. I have to say it changed my life. And the 20 years thereafter have really been a kind of learning curve to think about that continuous narrative from 1.5 million years ago to today, and to develop a mantra, which I'll discuss more tomorrow, about the notion that in our settings, all things need to connect across time and place. And in fact, I think that is what makes the definition of a universal museum. A few critical points. This idea about looking at periods and cultures across time and around the globe is something that needs to be done always in context. And we'll be talking more through the rest of this conference about what contextualizing means, but it's also about thinking always about cross-cultural and cross-communal ties. Meaning that for museums today, what we do with our objects, regardless of the stretch of time that they represent, is to make stories that help illuminate our lives today and life in these challenging times today, whether those stories are from the past or from the present. And they really are about stretching ourselves so that we can interpret this world that we are now in for all of us who are in it together. Where we are today really does suggest a broadening of the definition of we as museums. The notion of universal, where it begins, where it ends, perhaps is not so material. In our museum in Jerusalem, we begin with prehistory. But I'm not sure it matters if you start there or if you start in Neolithic times, if you start in classical antiquity. I'm not sure it matters if you end in the 19th century, the 20th century, or the 21st century. And perhaps what this suggests is that we need to be moving toward the notion of a universal collective that embraces all of us together. Neil actually made reference to the notion of lending to one another. And I'll speak tomorrow about the importance of our bringing our objects together from many institutions at one time, because it speaks to us on so many different levels. And what that kind of collective approach might do is demonstrate our collective power as museums, and the notion that our joining forces at museums might perhaps be increasingly important in these times in which we live. And in many ways, first, if you look at the kind of destruction of cultural heritage that we've all been struggling with in these recent years, and we know that our job is the antithesis. Our job is to preserve that cultural heritage. And the second is to think that, given the political complexities of these times, some may think that what we do, that what museums are, and that what we do may be less relevant today. And the truth of the matter is that what we do and what museums are about could not be more relevant. So I think those are just a few points to help open us as we continue in these discussions. And I have to say, in our first 4.5 hours together, so many topics have come up that each of which could be a full day in itself. It's going to be a challenge. But opening all of these, I think, in a discussion like this couldn't be more important. And I really want to conclude these short remarks just with a comment on the genesis of this gathering. And it was, and Marion described it earlier today, Hartwig a few years ago here did a classical music festival to kind of give comfort in what are becoming increasingly fractured times. The idea emerged that we should do this again, that it should be in Jerusalem. It happened in May, June of this year, and then at the British Museum next year, so that from the East and the West, a fractured Europe is being comforted by several hundred years of classical music. When the idea was brought to us, we immediately responded because, in fact, this sets the context for exactly what we as museums are about and need to be about. So actually, I want to thank Marion for creating that opportunity together with Hartwig and Daniel Kunel, who is here, who was the artistic director for our festival and will be in London. And really, it has been something quite moving. And I think Daniel can attest to how moving it was to be with us for the opening and closing of that month of several hundred years of classical music, beginning with Bach's Mass in B minor, ending with Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde, in Isamu Noguchi's Asian landscape laid over the deep, powerful Jerusalem landscape, and to hear those incredible compositions in the delicate light of that landscape looking out into the darkness over Jerusalem was something quite powerful, and I think it says something quite meaningful about what it is that we do, why we are all here together to think about how we can do what we do in the most powerful and meaningful way. So, for the moment, thank you.
So we have about, is this on? About 15 minutes, and thank you very much, all four of you, for insightful and provocative comments. Certainly got us thinking. I thought I might just ask the question that Marianne asked Olafur, which was for a radical idea. And I want to pick up on a word that Beatrice used, which was invitation. Hospitality, but invitation specifically. I'm wondering if there's an idea that you've seen in a museum or you wish you saw at a museum around the idea of invitation to respond to some of the issues that you've all raised about the notion of who belongs, who gets invited, whose voice speaks. Have you seen an example of something that maybe we should think deeply about, or is there something you've fantasized might happen in a museum that you haven't seen yet? And it's not necessarily a question for Beatrice, it's for all four of you. Something you'd like a museum to do around the notion of how you invite and welcome.
Should I say something? Well, I'm actually part of a group that works on a new kind of cultural institution that will open in New York City in 2019. And the question that we discuss a lot is, how do people gather in institutions, and how do we, I mean, there are theaters which have this collective modality of gathering. The door is closed, it's like here. The one speaks to the many are ordered in specific ways, the door is closed, there's a set beginning and end, and it has an amazing power to concentrate and focus energy and to create dramatic and great moments. One of you just described, and the museum could never produce that, but therefore a museum is individualized, it's liberal, you go and you can go on the fast lane or on the speed curator professional lane, or you can go there to have an experience. It can, yeah, so our question is, how can we work on modalities that are more flexible in between these collective, either collective or individualized forms of gathering, or to to put it in a more broad sense, like how do we want to gather? What seems to be an appropriate forms of gathering for our time? How connected, how disconnected should that be? How, with which parts of our bodies, our minds, our senses do we want to be present? What would be an example
of something you're thinking of
doing? As I'm saying, we are working on that, so it's more something I can't, if this would exist, we wouldn't.
Couldn't tell us.
Yeah, I mean, then we wouldn't need to invent it. But yeah, I guess you find it more in the modality of festivals that are more fluid and more temporal than in museums.
I'm not sure that I agree entirely with you, but I think we can postpone that a little bit. But I think the fluidity, I think, is the fluidity that Dorothea was just mentioning. I think is extremely valuable for thinking about the museums. And I was involved in a project where I thought at least the thought of it was kind of radical, and that really meant the invitation of a part of a collection to a situation from outside, which would offer very different conditions of showing, and that was a place in India. And where I thought that the radicality consisted in the fact that you were exposing, not in the exhibiting sense, but in the wider sense, exposing collected materials that had been in the collection for a long time to very different presenting conditions and to a very different way of relating to the audiences that were there. And I think it's around those kind of models that I would like to think. And of course, I agree entirely with you. It's just that I'm not so sure about whether the festival as such might be the only way, but I think it's the fluidity, this notion of things becoming what they are for a limited period of time.
Meanwhile, I found an example. You want to hear it? Maybe someone can help me here. What's the name of this Danish architect who I think won the Twin Tower in New York? Built one of, and he just opened a new museum in the south of Denmark, which just opened a few weeks ago. It's a local museum for the community there, and it's about the history.
Somebody have the name?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's a fantastic museum, and it has it's not a festival, but it combines different modalities of sort of collective and individualist forms of approach. It's very popular with the community there. It just opened. So you wanted an example.
You know, Matthew, perhaps it's not one answer, but many answers. And the first thing is that somehow
That's because James works at the Israel Museum, just to say there are many answers, right? There's no one answer.
You have to find a way to give everybody TSA pre-check so that there's no one out there in your potential constituency that feels hesitant about coming to your setting. That's the first thing. And then perhaps you have to liberate your setting so that you think of many ways to get those audiences also always thinking that whatever you do, and festivals aren't bad things, but everything has to be done so that there's a connection to what's inside, there's a connection to the material culture that we are privileged to preserve, and that respects that heritage at the same time that you're engaging with audiences on many different levels. You know, we all used to be, or some of us were so hesitant about social media as a way to draw audience or to familiarize audience. And the reality is that it is more and more a way. I'll speak a little about this tomorrow. But I think you have to open your minds in those ways and really liberate your setting. In our case, I say liberate the landscape because we have a vast one. But whether it's an enclosed building or a vast landscape, you need to liberate it in a way that is approachable by as many as possible.
Okay, you have to save this panel because it is allergic to specificity. There hasn't been a specific mention, and so you're going to share one with us. You just, but you didn't.
But that's actually a huge, it is a challenge because I think we're talking about structural questions, like And again, sorry, I fear I can't provide a very specific example, but I think in general, there are small museums, and this one you mentioned is one of them, where I think the greatest obstacle towards this feeling of being welcome, being sort of that there is hospitality, is the imbalance in sort of sharing of knowledge. And to a great extent, even sort of, I work at the museum, I work at a cultural institution which doesn't have a collection, which is very discourse-oriented, which is very, it engages in many ways, in many formats with the audience, but still there is, you feel that amongst the audience, many fear they don't know enough, they're hesitant to open up, to relate to the objects because of fear of that they could be ignorant, prove ignorant. And I think any museum, through its architecture, through its programming, should not only sort of facilitate knowing, but really inviting different perspectives, and not only as an addendum of now we reach out to the public, but as an integral part of the museum policy. And I find that is a great important factor in being a good host.
I know that James wants to say something, and I suspect others do, but I'm not going to let them, because I actually want to know if there are any questions from you that you'd like to propose. And since we're all friends and we're family together, I think what we should do is just, when you get the microphone, just say who you are and an affiliation, just so we know, since we're going to be hanging out together for a while. So who might have a question? Okay, what I do in staff meetings when there's no question, I saw Hartwig. I just want to say in staff meetings, when no one asks a question, I ask someone. Like I say, Eugene, why don't you have a question? Yuri, why don't you have a question? But you were saved because Hartwig is going to ask a question. He doesn't actually have a question. You go.
I'll ask a question for you. I'll ask a question for Eugene. Hospitality is obviously a very beautiful concept. I think there is two sides to it. One is you invite, and you're the host. The other is, I'm Hartwig Fischer, by the way. I'm sorry.
I was thinking about the fact that only someone from England would introduce himself. Then I thought, well, maybe somebody from Dresden would introduce himself. But then I realized everyone knows who you are, so it's okay.
No. The other is somebody knocks at your door, and you have to open that door. That's hospitality. And that's the ancient concept of hospitality. That's when you have to accept who comes to your house. That's the radical concept of hospitality. You have no choice, because either you're a human being, and then you open your door. And whoever crosses your threshold, he's in your house. And I would like to think about hospitality in encyclopedic museums also in that sense, in that very radical sense, that you host, you give presence, you give space. Not only in this somewhat, self-evident kind of generosity. You are challenged, because all the lives that cross your threshold, you don't control them. You don't have, you don't dominate them. They will tell you who they are and what they want and why they're there. That's a completely different ballgame.
So I find it...
it's not even a question.
That's not really a question, but it relates back to what Neil was talking about, the notion of free. And it's something we have to come back to in some way. What constitutes free? And at the moment at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, they're very deeply talking about the question that if you're from New York, you can give a certain amount, but if you're not from New York, you have to give something else. So pause around that and think about what that means in terms of hospitality, knocking on the door, inviting people in. I'm suggesting that's troublesome.
And inviting, it's the objects that are there. They have come into your house. It's people and objects.
So Beatrice, why didn't you talk about free? In your concept of hospitality and invitation, and is it something that you go to fairly easily?
No, I think I agree with Hartwig Fischer in as much as that's the most radical way of understanding hospitality, and I think that's the way Derrida would actually phrase it. But he would acknowledge too, and that's what I'm interested in, is this, well, I think it's not a freedom if you knock at somebody else's door, because it's an urgent situation, usually, when you offer hospitality. But the way that it is allowed for is usually connected to rules. And even if you allow or you give hospitality to everybody or everything that knocks on your door, it goes together with certain rules. And what I'm interested in is how much can you shape and change these rules under which hospitality is allowed for in order to make it possible to become host and guest at the same time and to find an exchange in that. And I think some of the problems that we're discussing with encyclopedic museums have to do with ideas of hierarchies that are existing between somebody who knows and somebody who doesn't know, or something that tells you something that is specific, but in fact is much less specific because it depends on who's looking at it, or who's hosting it, or who's guesting him or herself. So what I'm interested in is how do we make these relations between host and guest more porous and more operative in a creative way. So that's a freedom.
I'll get to you in just one moment, but the two questions from people who've already asked questions. Is there anybody who hasn't asked a question yet who wants to? Okay.
Sorry, I'm asking.
No, it's fine.
Question.
I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm only just trying to move it around. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Nana Ofriat-Ayim. I'm from Ghana, and I'm an art historian, and I direct a contemporary art center in Ghana. It's quite astounding to me, listening to this, how far apart the discourse that's happening on the continent is to what's happening here. It's quite mind-blowing to me. And in terms of the discourse of hospitality and guest and the Encyclopedic Museum, for me, that kind of, the foundations of that discourse are so faltered because, you know, when Neil McGregor earlier spoke about who has the right to speak for who has the right to speak whose narrative, a lot of those narratives that are in the encyclopedic museums, nobody invited people in as guests to speak on our behalf. You know, and I'm speaking from, you know, I'm not speaking on anyone's behalf, I'm speaking from very much my subjective position. So I'm really kind of confounded by this notion of hospitality when the very foundations of the Encyclopedic Museum kind of denounce that notion. So it's almost like you're starting from here, when really we should be starting from here, which is the foundation of the Encyclopedic Museum and the arrogance of it, to say, you know, this is an encyclopedic museum that's kind of made on all of your behalves. We speak on behalf of your narratives, but now we're going to be hospitable and invite you all in as guests. I mean, to me, this conversation is so... I feel like it needs to go back to the very basic of... I know that we're speaking about the role of the Encyclopedic Museum in complex political times in Europe, but nowadays you cannot speak about Europe without including other voices. You just can't.
So back to the basic of
asking yourself, what is an encyclopedic museum, not just in this complex political time in Europe, but in this complex political time globally? That's kind of, I know that this conversation is very much based on what's happening in Europe, but I don't think you can have this conversation without including the viewpoints and the starting point of the Encyclopedic Museum starting in Europe was problematic. And therefore we need to go back to a point which is that we are all have equal voices and narratives, and we all have the right to speak on our own behalves. And so for one person, one side that spoke
that says they're being hospitable, that very notion, that very concept of hospitality needs to be questioned. And I'm just curious as to why nobody is addressing that.
James wants to respond, and I don't know, Beatrice, if you want to, but James wants to say something.
Well, actually, I had a comment to add before on free, not free, and it relates to this. I also am not from Europe. And it's interesting because free, not free is a question, but there's a flip side to your point, which is inclination to come, which has to do with the premise of your place and how the story is told, how the narrative is told, and whether it's told from an outsider's perspective or an insider's. And you also have to go back to thinking through who the audience is supposed to be today. And if the audience wants to be inclusive, you have a very substantial portion of that audience which may not know about museums, which doesn't have museums in its history, and which doesn't necessarily want to be in a museum. So some of your thinking has to be in a creative way about how to build an incentive to come, and a lot of it has to do with participating with what the narrative is about.
I can do that later in the discussion, but I really want to make clear that I am not sure whether I understand the vigor of your argument in front of the fact that I explicitly said that we must talk about the practices through which these museums actually came into being and how they now function with or without a sensitivity in relation to their history. And I think it's not the concept of hospitality we have to discuss in the grounds of it, because I think it offers us, in its ambivalence, a potential to discuss exactly whether an invitation is voiced or not voiced, but nevertheless, even with or without an invitation, there are many uninvited guests, there are many guests that have never become guests, but should have become guests. I think all these notions that are implicit in hospitality can very much be part of exactly the grounding of the encyclopedic idea. And let's discuss that later on, because I think there's a lot to be said.
I think you've given us something to continue as a thread through the course of the next 2 days. Do you want to ask your question? Yeah.
May I say, sorry.
Sure.
Or,
no, go.
No, just to, I feel also a bit uncomfortable in this context, host and hospitality, because it's very codified, and I think the urgencies of today, and to a certain extent, I mean, I don't agree fully, but to a certain extent I see that there is a certain urgency that goes beyond now talking about host and hospitality. I think it's about willing to take risks, that your certainties are being shaken, that you invite in people, not invite in, but that you actually, there is you create situations where this will happen, this shaking of convictions through controversial viewpoints, through certain histories. And I think this, to me, would be actually, and I don't want to sort of use this host metaphor, but that would be, for me, an ideal scenario if we reach a point where all these questions can be addressed in a really on an equal level. I think this is, because this is in the host, it's all about receiving and codes of behavior, and it's gone too far to use this metaphor, I think.
Not just because Beatrice and I used to have tea at the basement of the Courtauld many years ago. I just want to say the following. I think it's a little simplistic to imply that the argument around hospitality is about a party. I think it's about a conversation. And if it's about a conversation, then I think you get back to the complexity of what Beatrice was saying in relation to how do you change the storyline in order to create that, and whose voice do you invite in. But again, I do think this is for us to continue to talk about.
I'm Peggy Levitt from Wellesley College and Harvard. And I wanted to tease out another point that you raised about, the idea of universality and common ground, and is that possible, which speaks to the last question as well. And what I heard was kind of two different tracks. So one is, what can museums do given their history? I think most of us are here because we care about complex times and trying to make the world a better place. So there are constraints in institutions, there are walls, there are histories. What can we do with that? But also, are there other venues that are perhaps more agile, more flexible, more responsive, that can complement, supplement, go in parallel? So this idea of festivals. And when you were saying, I think that hip-hop might, I think it was you saying, I think that hip-hop might be a better place, I was struck by, are we doing classical music or are we doing hip-hop? And why do we actually have to choose? Because they're both doing important work and they're more powerful together. So we just have to be more open to different kinds of possibilities.
Yes. Thanks, Peggy.
Yeah, my name is Siraj Rasool from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. I just wanted to add that it was quite interesting to notice how people were grasping for examples of a new form of museum, and people were only thinking about Europe. Whereas what's been quite interesting is how the notion of museum has changed in quite fundamental ways, and how the major examples of such new museologies are not in Europe. They're either in Latin America or they're on the African continent. And yes, these might be strategic deployments of the idea of the museum, where the museum is not the collection. The museum is a social space, and it does the work. So yes, we must think of the festival, but we must not relinquish the museum to a certain set of meanings.
Thank you for that. I think we're just about done, but in the category of deep unfairness, I'm going to ask Neil McGregor a question. So you presented your thoughts. You've sat here deeply absorbing what you've heard. I'm wondering if there's something that you've heard in the last hour that has complicated some of your thinking or created a new question for yourself.
Yes.
And we have about 45 minutes for Neil's response, okay?
It's a very simple one. It has indeed complicated everything, but I think what is made clear to me is the real question about entitlement to this. Who are these collections for? That means who has a right to use them? And I think that's really one of the fundamental questions, which goes back to questions of ownership, repatriation or whatever, trusteeship concern. But that fundamental question, which I think is the question that was being asked partly, is who is entitled to use these and to use them as they want? Because that seems to me really the fundamental question, that they have to be used by everybody as they want, not as other people decide.
Thank you, Neil. So I think we're done for today, but I know that we all look forward to gathering later this evening. You're going to say what it is, and then we're all gathering tomorrow. I hope everyone's coming back, and we'll keep going, and we'll pick up on some of the themes that have been raised. I will make sure that they stay alive, although my hunch is that you'll make sure they stay alive. So hold on one moment, because Marian's just going to tell us what's going to happen now.
So first I have to thank you, all of you, for all the work and all the brilliant thoughts and the energy you brought into the space, also the colleagues we were discussing. So I think we have to cut out this in Europe. It was more an attitude of being modest, because when I came to Dresden, the first call came from Jerzy Veit from Prague, It's only 1 hour 15 minutes, and we decided to start with our international neighbors, and so many things are there to do. And this thing to concentrate also on our neighbor countries and to start with them was very important in the last days. But I would say we cut it out tomorrow. It's different. Perhaps we have found the right title at the end of the symposium. In any case, I'm very glad that we have 2 other days, because I think the word complex, that we can leave it. So I have to do an announcement for our get-together tonight. So from now on till how long as you want to, I don't know, 11:30, midnight, you can stay here, and we have catering and music. The names of the DJs are DNZ, Fat Fenders, and Philip Demankowski, Uncanny Valley. And I'm happy also that we could have a party tonight. Thank you for all of you.